All right. Hello, everybody. All right. So yeah, if you want to, if you can keep this interactive and you have questions, please let me know. Try to answer them in the 30 minutes that I have, but it's really your time here. So, okay. So, what happened? I don't have a screensaver. I'm looking at it. Let's see. I'll unplug it and plug it in again. It's all good. I know. Sorry, guys. Hey, it's back. Okay, so if I do that, you can see it, right? And I do that, you can still see it. Okay, great. Test one. Okay, so we're going to be talking about harnessing the power of PaaS services for IT modernization. How many people have deployed stuff in Azure Government? A couple people? Good. In Azure in general? In commercial? A little more? Great. Okay. Have you deployed any PaaS services at all? Yes? A few? Mostly VMs? If you're deploying in Azure? VMs? Okay. So our agenda today, we're going to be talking about some of the questions that are facing modern IT. Maybe you guys have had similar questions. We're going to have an example of sort of the IT modernization journey. So how you can go from VMs to other things and how that can look. We're going to do a demo of a PaaS service and architecture, and we can talk a little bit more in depth about that and kind of go as deep as you guys want to. I sort of have a little bit of a developer sort of background, but I won't go to dev, geeky on you. And then we're going to talk about some of the IT tasks that PaaS services can make easier. And if we have time, a little discussion. So we're going to talk about some of the questions facing modern IT. Things like, what is the right size of the servers for my business? How do I deploy new code to my server? Who monitors my application? How do I patch my operating system? How do I handle configuration in a centralized way and sort of keep all my servers and services consistent? How many servers do I need? And how do I do failover and geo-redundancy? Those are all sort of questions that people have when they're in the IT business, especially in this modern day and age. So what's the easy button here? What can I tell you guys to sort of help with a lot of those questions so that you don't really have to worry about it, or it can be sort of done for you in some way? And the answer we have here is using PaaS services. So initially we sort of talked about VMs as a starting point. We're going to be talking about what it looks like to sort of move from the VMs into the PaaS services, and specifically PaaS services for apps and data. Now, when we talk about the PaaS services for apps and data, we'll start with the PaaS services for apps, just so you can see the icons when I have them on the screen for the architectures, as well as when you're in the portal and you're sort of like, what's this thing here? You can know that I told you about it. So web applications, you can deploy pretty much applications that you would be building in Node, Java, C#, IIS applications that you want to move into the cloud, API apps, which are pretty much not UI applications. They're the sort of the back-end things that can drive the APIs of your organization. There's sort of a nice PaaS service that helps make that easy to deploy. And pretty much my favorite, the favorite service that is lit up and really important for agencies is the app service environment. And I'll show you in the architecture diagram how this fits in, but really it's an isolated hosting stamp for running PaaS services inside your organizational sort of boundary. And I know Jim's going to talk more about the boundaries conversation, but this is really important because you can get both the benefits of isolation and compliance, and you get the configuration and deployment. And we're going to look at that even in a demo as well. Another one that's really near and dear to my heart is Azure API management, and really taking your APIs and having a centralized plane that you can manage those and do some things with that, like caching and management certificates and like rate limiting. So if you say an application, you only want them to call you like once an hour, but they call you 30 times in the first second. You could actually say, sorry, you're calling me too much. Call back in an hour, really. And that's actually built into the system. And then those are the PaaS services, or the platforms services. But there's also a concept called serverless that you guys might hear about either tonight or in later talks. And that's a situation where you handle requests based on the number of requests. They're event driven, and you sort of pay for the number of transactions that happen, not necessarily a VM itself or amount of memory or number of cores. You actually, based on the amount of requests you make. And then logic apps. Has anyone heard of logic apps before? Yeah, great. So they're a serverless platform for integrations and workflow. And you can use sort of drag and drop connectors together. And it's similar to the Microsoft Flow on the Office 365 side. So then there's PaaS services for data. We have SQL Azure, which is a managed relational database. Cosmos DB, which is globally distributed. Very low latency. Then there's MySQL as a managed service, and PostgreSQL, which as a managed service. And then there's other areas like for data related to caching. So Redis, have you ever heard of Redis? So there's a Redis cache, a managed Redis cache in Azure and in Azure Government. And then there's Azure Data Factory, which is nice to orchestrate data movement between migrations and moving data around. So we're going to go through an example sort of similar to when we opened up for sort of what people were exposed to. And we're going to talk about sort of a beginning on-premises architecture. This probably looks pretty familiar. You have like a Windows server or 2 Windows servers in the front end. You have 3 SQL servers in the back end. Maybe they're doing some sort of always-on clustering and highly available. And then maybe you have this async replication to an off-site location for your DR. Your DR, sort of cluster may be dark, meaning it's not active all the time. It's just maybe, accepting the replication itself. And you would only fail over to the DR cluster or the DR site, should you be in an actual disaster and you execute your disaster recovery plan for that. So that's the on-premises web architecture. You have an IIS servers and a database for SQL. Let's look at sort of an agency-based cloud IaaS web API architecture. So you have the on-premises part on the bottom, and then you have express route connections going up into multiple regions for the Azure virtual networks there. You can still have the IaaS servers, but now they're in VMs or they're in Azure VMs, and you can also have your always-on cluster, and you can replicate that to your offsite facility the same way. You may add that sort of diamond-looking thing. You may add a service which is an internal load balancer as part of the cloud to sort of balance between the 2 IaaS servers. Maybe you had in the previous case, you may have had an F5 or some other type of load balancer in front of that. And then you have sort of maybe a replication of the actual host OS drives and things like that using something called Azure Site Recovery. And it's a great solution to have, to be able to replicate your data sort of automatically. And then you have, between those, you may have, global VNet peering between the two regions. So that's the IaaS architecture. Now let's look at the PaaS web architecture. So you still have the on-premises scenario, but maybe you have a concept of a traffic manager which directs traffic between multiple regions, and it's deployable in Azure Government. Then you hit the green thing in there, that's an app gateway. That's another PaaS service that sort of acts like a load balancer, but it has a firewall capability. OWASP, I think, is the term for firewall specs, and it also provides logging and metrics for the app gateway. So that's sort of your front end sort of firewall into your environment, and then you can call the API management service. You can call the Redis cache, and you can also have, I'm trying to depict here, the app service environment running in your VNet. So it's deployed in your virtual network. It's a PaaS service that you don't necessarily have to patch or really worry about. It's managed by the Microsoft Data Center team as part of the FedRAMP boundary that sort of exists. So then you have, that's in the virtual network. now your SQL servers that used to be in your virtual network, you're now you can migrate your data to the Azure SQL services in the upper left, or the Cosmos DB database. So that's sort of a way you can sort of scale out your architecture. And now also what's interesting is that if possible, you could also have both regions active. And we do this within multiple agencies where you have scenarios where you have a lot of like read-only data, or if your app tier can be active, and then you essentially have your backend database tier highly available, and maybe it's only primary in one region depending on where you want to do your writes and reads. Or Cosmos DB does something in a magic that handles that for us. So are there any questions on this PaaS architecture? Yes?
Same gateway service, same gateway service, you're trying to use Power BI in the cloud, but the data is actually on-prem.
So the question was, is this the same gateway service that you use if you're using Power BI in the cloud? No, the app gateway is really, it's a more of a network appliance in that way. So it handles, essentially it's a reverse proxy. So a gateway in the case that you're talking with Power BI is really a data gateway, which you would deploy in a network either on premises to be able to reach like line of sight to a data resource. The Azure Data Factory also has a similar concept called an integration engine, I think. SSIS, an integration engine that you could look at as well. But Power BI is a fantastic service that when you want to reach certain services, you would probably deploy a gateway. But it's a little different in this case. The other thing interesting about a Power BI gateway is it has to run on a virtual machine. In these cases, these are just deployable services. And the magic here is the fact that because they're Azure government services, at certain tiers you can deploy into the virtual network. So an IP address that you would be on your in-premises environment, you can actually reach the connections that are there, which is pretty powerful. Great question. Yes?
Can you talk about the data and the logs that you might get off of the app gateway for security?
Yeah. So there are, I'm trying to think, that wasn't in my demo, but it's great that you're asking. So I think you have the metrics, so the number of requests that go through, per second, per hour. But you also have the request that was coming in, the IP address of the request that was coming in, as well as the target it was going to, the time it took, and the response time that you got back. Now, what's powerful about this scenario is that you could use something called Azure Monitor in order to push the logs where you want them. So there may have been some other meetups on Azure Monitor, but you can push it to a storage account, you can push it to Log Analytics. When you push it to Log Analytics, you now start having a centralized way of looking at your data across multiple app gateways if it's all kind of centralized. The other nice thing about Log Analytics, if you have things like VMs that have syslogs in them, you can deploy a Log Analytics agent on that, and now you've married both the app gateway logs and like the VM logs themselves, or in some cases IIS logs are helpful too. So if you had a VM in your network, you could deploy the Log Analytics agent and get the VM logs put together. Yes?
How about threat analytics? Are there any security threat analytics extended to that gateway that might help us?
So that's when I sort of went over so no, I don't think there is, but there's a firewall, the ciphers that you specifically want to accept, and there's a passive firewall mode, which essentially says, let things in, just log and alert, or essentially like a hard deny if it doesn't, like cross-site scripting or something like that. So advanced threat analytics is sort of like another thing, and Security Center is also a lot larger than this one thing. It plugs into that, but it's not sort of a turnkey threat analytics for your network perspective. In the commercial space, there's also something called Azure Front Door that you may hear about, right? So there's similar concepts in that. Great, thank you guys for the questions. It makes this a lot more exciting. Okay, any other questions on this? I'm gonna do a demo. How am I doing on time, Karina? I talk a lot, so. Good? Okay. All right, so demo. All right. So one thing that's interesting about this this website, and it's also available. Eugen did a great blog post on this, and I sort of deployed it into Azure Government in multiple ways. I deployed it into a multi-tenant app service that you just deploy like a web app to, but I also deployed it into an ASE. So you could kind of, so I was able to explain and even show in certain areas how it's different deploying into something that isn't internet accessible. Right? You have to think about, well, you can't just, open up some, GitHub repo and directly, post data or, publish apps to it, because there may not be line of sight there in an agency that was locked down. So let me see if this works. Timed out. Okay, hold on. All right, so I'm going to go to trafficdemo.azure.gov.net, and what you'll immediately notice when I logged in there is that I got Azure Active Directory Authentication enabled in this demo. It's using OpenID, but there's another. You can also use OAuth capabilities, and I'll show you just how easy PaaS services make authentication as well. So this is just a place where you would have traffic cases, and you file a new case, and put my name and violation, speeding really fast, and some sort of, and then you say filed, and it creates it. Now what's happened, well, when you say filed, when it's doing it, date of infraction is required. Sorry, is it still required? Let's try that. Okay, should I do it? Okay, yeah. So I added it, and it said speeding really fast, as you see. Now what ends up happening here is that it's just a web app, and it has a connection to Cosmos DB, which is sort of a nice way to scale out your backend database. And this is sort of it could be an application that was now moved to the cloud and sort of modified to fit the Cosmos DB scenario. And then what's also interesting, and the code's all available, but if you look at the closed cases, these are, when they're closed, they get dropped into like a queue or an offline storage, so you can kind of clean up the, what you have here. Now, what's interesting about this at a base level, we talked a little bit about Traffic Manager, saying load balancing between multiple regions. I want to show you guys that. So here's the Meetup Traffic Manager demo, and what you can do is in multiple regions, you can deploy endpoints in multiple regions, and then it'll load balance, kind of like DNS round robin or F5s, essentially. That's really, really powerful, and you can also set a setting for how you want to route. Do you want to route on weighted, priority, geographic, closest to your certain region? And what I think is really nice about this is that it can also be used for DR. You could have a scenario where you're always going through the traffic manager, but now you go ahead and you want to fail over. All you're doing is going into the Azure portal and saying, all your traffic go over here now. So you can do active, or the failover, and it sort of allows you to recover quickly if there's any issue within one application or one region you need to fail over. All right, so let's see. That's the traffic app. Let's see. Let me go ahead and do more stuff. So I talked to you about Cosmos DB, and I said that the data was in Cosmos DB. You can see here, when we're selecting from the statuses, and then I can select from the traffic cases, and you'll probably see Aaron speeding really fast right here as a document in the Cosmos DB. And then, let me see. Oh, the other thing I want to show you is now I want to go inside my net. This is all external stuff, right, in the portal and that kind of thing. Now I'm going to show you what happens inside my sort of corporate network, right? This is now internally accessible only. Like I can't get to this address externally, and the IP address isn't available externally. And notice it's talking to the same database. But that's really, really powerful. And let me show you one more thing here, which is, there's the traffic manager. Okay, so this is the app service that is servicing the internal application. And one thing that's great about this is, and app services in general, if you're not familiar with PaaS services, you now get just metrics out of the box. Because it's a service and it's deployed, you now get some information about the metrics of how the service is performing. You also, as we were talking a little bit about configuration, you also get the ability to just bring your configuration in your code and deploy your application. You don't have to worry about number of VMs, how much memory, how many servers, things like that. And you have all your application settings sort of in one area, and it's all sort of bundled together. So you can deploy your config in your code and not really worry about the servers. You can also, of course, you can add SSL settings, but you can also scale up and out. So you can scale up, meaning I can go from 1 core to 2 cores to 4 cores on each instance, and I can scale out, which means I can go from from one server to multiple services. And let me show you that part too. That was the app plan. And then let's see if I can get back to here. The other thing I want to show you is I want to prove to you that this is in fact internally accessible. And by doing that, you can see this is an app plan, and notice it's isolated, small. There's like S1 through whatever that are externally accessible, but there's also isolated plans that are used here. And if I go here to this app service environment, you can see that the IP address of it is in fact internal, and this is using an internal DNS name. So I think that's really powerful for the scenario where you would take an IIS application, you want to keep the isolation being in your boundary, and you want to go ahead and deploy to the cloud in a secure manner. So back to the, yes,
Can you go back to the screen
absolutely.
that had authentication?
Oh,
And look at
yes.
what kind of logs came to, what kind of logs came up?
Authentication. Okay.
Was the backup screen up there?
Right. So let me go back to here, and then so the authentication, thank you for reminding me. It's awesome. Here within authentication and authorization, it's not about logs here. It's truly about taking an application, it's truly about taking an application that has no authentication at all, and in the service saying, I want to support Azure Active Directory. And when you do that, it locks it down, and now you're using your tenant for authentication, which is really, so think about all the code that you'd have to write in order to do authentication into Azure Active Directory with the OAuth authentication, etc. If you deploy your service to app services, and you can go ahead and you can check a checkbox. This is called Easy Auth. You can check a checkbox. You can specify your client ID, your issuer URL, which is from Azure AD when you create your app registration, and then your secret. And when you do that, it locks your service down, which is really powerful. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody after the session on how to do that and why to do that. So we're going to go talk about just some summary here on what IT tasks can be made easier through PaaS services. OS patching is non-existent because the services are deployed on your behalf by the Microsoft Data Center, in the Microsoft Data Center, and managed by the Microsoft Data Center. You deploy your config in your code, which is really powerful. Configuration management, I showed you the application settings and those types of things are deployed either with your code or can be deployed into the service, but you're not having a bunch of configuration, web configs all over the place, files, for various configuration. You try to centralize it, and if you want to make it even more secure, you can use something called Key Vault in order to secure secrets in a centralized kind of HSM security manner. Then you have monitoring and logging in there. I didn't show you all the different monitors themselves, but there's also, when you can have the logs themselves, but you also have the metrics, and you want to have those centrally located so that you can query them, build reports from them, dashboards, Power BI. Those are all great things to have for monitoring and logging. You have geo load balancing. Using DNS entries, using Traffic Manager. You have staging and deployment. You can create slots where you can go ahead and you can say you want to deploy to a slot in production or non-production, and this is your next version, your V2, and now you're ready to switch you just go ahead and you switch the slots. It goes from non-production to production just like that. No downtime, anything, you just go ahead, now you're live. You can do that. One thing we do when we're sort of deploying public websites, in some cases, it's okay to just even fail over an entire region. So you're running active on multiple regions. You want to upgrade the app in one region. You make that app, the region sort of non-available to the world. You upgrade it, and then you swap over again. And that works really well for multiple like databases and other things in multiple regions. And then finally, backup and restore in the service itself. Backup nightly. Restore, find your restores point, and restore it. And then authentication, as you guys have already seen, which is pretty awesome. That's a great question. So when you could have multiple regions that you could back up to. So you'd back up to a storage account, but then you could replicate that storage account to another region as needed. So it's kind of off-site because it's in the cloud and there's multiple copies of the data itself. But then if you want to have it in another region, you can either mark the storage account read-only, geo read-only, GRSRA, I think it is. And then you can even, if you ran into an issue in one region, you could actually access it in another region at that point. Great question. Okay, I know I'm over time, but I think there's one more easy button, okay? And so what I think is really powerful, and what I've been doing recently with multiple customers, is there may be APIs in your organization that haven't been looked at. They're in some language, you don't really know, you don't know who's responsible for them, they just work, and that's good. You don't know what the SLA is, et cetera. But what you can do is you can use an Azure service called API management. You can bind it into your virtual network like we talked about. You can then front end all the APIs that you want in your organization. No matter they're regular Swagger APIs or WSDL, like low XML or whatever it is. You can provide a single API.myagency.gov, and then people can connect using API management, and you're essentially front-ending all these, and you're giving them a modern development interface in order to develop against. And I just want to show you guys briefly. I know I'm way over. Oh, wow, good. I talk a lot, but okay. So this is API management, and what I did is I went through a quick start, and you can see here you have things, I didn't really call anything, but you have capacity, you have number of requests, and you have latency. So things that you don't have control over are now sort of buried away somewhere within your organization. If you create a facade or a surface that, a plane that people can talk to in a modern way, you can also get information about how long those requests take. And you can even do caching in front of them. You have that slow server under someone's desk. You can turn on caching for that API such that you go ahead and you only call them once every 5 minutes. You've just reduced the load for that system, and you've now gotten visibility to what's going on there. So just as a quick example, we have APIs. Let's see. You can have a developer portal that is customized to your organization that allows you to see, hopefully this comes up, allows you to see, so this is just a standard developer portal that you can have templates for and do other things, and you can expose your APIs in a way that developers can come there, and if they want to call the conference demo API, they now have examples in multiple languages how to call your APIs, which is extremely powerful. So I say try it, but then you can also see here, code samples. Here's the Java example on how to call this API. You just copy this, put it into your jar file, and you're ready to go. PHP is the same thing that allows you to say, this is how you call your APIs here. So you're giving a modern presentation on older APIs. Not only that, I was just talking to Jim, and this hit me, is the fact that when you want to modernize those APIs, you've already created the facade for people to call, and you can now work on those APIs and switch the API from an older version to a newer version without the client changing anything. because they made the decision to target your API service, api.agency.gov. So that's my last easy button for IT modernization, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone after the discussion. All I got. Cool. Who's next? Yep. Let me make it that. Did I go too far, or is it? Okay.